The wind cut through the empty streets like a blade, the snow falling in thick, merciless sheets. Everything around her was silent except for the howling storm. Her small, trembling figure was barely visible in the thick snow, crouched on the frozen concrete near the riverbank. She hadn't moved for what felt like hours. The little girl's blonde hair was matted against her pale face, tangled and wet from the snow. She was shivering, curled into a tiny ball to protect herself from the cold, her knees pressed tightly to her chest. Her body, so fragile and small, seemed lost in the relentless winter. But what hurt more than the cold was the absence of warmth, the lack of anyone to help her. She clutched a faded pink backpack with a torn strap, her fingers wrapped tightly around it, as though it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Her lips trembled as she drew in shallow, broken breaths, but her eyes, her wide, hollow eyes, stared ahead, empty and lost. There was no one here. The little girl, no older than 6, looked as if she had been left alone for far too long. Her clothes, thin and ragged, barely shielded her from the brutal cold. Her small sneakers were soaked through, leaving dark stains in the snow beneath her. Bruises marred her arms, faint but clear against her pale skin. She had been running, hiding, trying to escape, but now she had nowhere to go. In the distance, there was a sound, the soft thud of boots on snow, approaching slowly. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She had learned long ago not to expect anyone to come, not to trust the shadows that lingered. She wrapped her arms tighter around her knees, shrinking into herself, hoping the world would forget her, hoping she could just disappear into the cold. A voice broke through the silence, a man's voice, low and gentle, calling to her from a distance. "Hey there," he said, his words like a lifeline in the cold night. "Are you all right?" The girl didn't answer. She didn't trust answers anymore. She didn't trust words. She tightened her grip on the backpack, eyes darting toward the sound of the voice, then quickly back to the ground. "It's okay," the man said, softer this time. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" His footsteps came closer. She still didn't move. She had been waiting for this moment, hadn't she? The moment when someone would finally find her. But she wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure she could believe anyone anymore. The man crouched in front of her, his eyes full of something, pity maybe, or something else that was harder to read. He extended a hand to her, but she flinched back, a visible shudder passing through her tiny body. "I'm not going to hurt you," he repeated, his voice steady. "My name is Eli. What's yours?" The girl didn't answer. She couldn't. She had lost her name a long time ago, lost the feeling of it ever being hers. Eli's hand stayed outstretched, his gaze soft but firm. He was waiting for something, a sign, a clue, anything that could help him understand what had happened to her. She looked at him, then, her wide eyes meeting his for the first time. She saw something in his gaze, something that didn't look like the others. Maybe it was the lack of fear, or the quiet certainty that he would be here for her. But in that moment, the girl let go of the last thread of suspicion she had left. And then, just as Eli thought she might speak, her lips trembled and she whispered, barely audible, "Please don't take me back there." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just lost. She was running from someone. Eli's heart sank, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded, his hand still open in front of her. His voice was calm, but urgent. "You're safe now," he said. "We'll get you somewhere warm." But the girl shook her head, pulling herself even tighter into a ball, as if the world was pressing in on her from every side. "I don't want to go back," she repeated, her voice breaking like glass. "Please." Eli sat still, his hand just inches from the girl's trembling form. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, but it was the kind of silence that held something unspoken, a promise, an unspoken understanding. He knew, without asking, that this little girl had seen too much for her age, and he knew that whatever she had been through had left scars deeper than the bruises on her skin. The wind howled louder now, rattling the broken windows above them. But Eli didn't move. He watched her, waiting for a sign that she was ready to trust him. His heart ached for her, but he couldn't let his emotions take over. Not yet. He had to be the calm, the protector, just like Shadow. Shadow, his faithful K9, lay on the ground beside the girl now, his large, muscular body pressed against the cold floor as if to shield her from the storm. His amber eyes never left the girl, and Eli could see that the dog was already forming a bond with her, just as he had with Eli. Shadow had a way of reading people, and right now, his calm presence seemed to do more than words ever could. Eli exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "I know you're scared, kid. I can't imagine what you've been through, but I promise you, I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." The girl didn't respond. Her head remained lowered, her small body curled tighter against itself. Eli could see the way she flinched when the wind gusted or when a nearby door creaked open. She was always waiting for the next attack, the next betrayal. Her body spoke volumes without a single word. His fingers twitched as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a worn photograph. He studied it for a moment before turning his attention back to the girl. "This is Shadow," Eli said, nodding towards the dog, who was now lying flat against the floor, his head resting gently on the girl's knee. "He's been with me through thick and thin. He's not like the others. He's not going to hurt you." The girl's gaze flickered briefly to the dog, her wide eyes hesitant, but there was a tiny spark of curiosity there. Her trembling fingers reached out, and with the slightest hesitation, she touched the top of Shadow's head. The dog didn't move, only gave a soft, comforting whine, his eyes softening as if he understood her fear. "It's okay," Eli whispered, his voice quieter now. "He's here to protect you." For a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. It was just the three of them, Eli, Shadow, and the girl. The storm continued to rage, but in the small, dimly lit room, there was a quiet sense of peace. It was fragile, but it was there. The kind of peace that had been lost for so long but was now beginning to take root. The girl, still clutching her pink backpack, looked up at Eli for the first time since he had approached. Her eyes were full of fear, but there was something else too, something fragile, something hopeful that he hadn't expected to see so soon. "What's your name?" Eli asked softly, keeping his voice gentle. He didn't want to push her, but the question had been lingering in the air between them, and now felt like the right moment to ask. She didn't speak right away. Her fingers curled tighter around the straps of the backpack, as if she were debating whether or not to trust him with the answer. Her lips parted slightly, and after a long moment, she whispered, "Lily." Eli's heart clenched at the sound of her voice. It was a quiet, fragile thing, but it was a name, her name. He repeated it softly, committing it to memory. "Lily? It's nice to meet you, Lily." The girl didn't respond, but Eli could see the small shift in her, her shoulders slightly relaxed, her fingers less tense. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the first sign that she might be willing to trust him. Eli shifted closer, but not too close. He didn't want to push her again, but he couldn't leave her here in this abandoned place. He needed to get her out of the cold, out of this nightmare. He reached into his jacket pocket once more and pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to his friend, Grace, a caseworker he had worked with in the past. He had to get help for Lily, fast. "Don't worry, Lily," he said softly, his fingers lightly brushing the hem of his phone. "We're going to get you somewhere safe. We'll figure this out, I promise." Her eyes flickered to his phone, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The fear in her eyes spoke louder than any words ever could. She had been through too much. She had seen too much. And now she was here, in the cold, trusting the first person who had shown her even the smallest amount of kindness. But that was all Eli needed. That flicker of trust. It was enough for him to take the first step toward saving her. "Let's get you out of here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "You're not alone anymore." He stood up slowly, keeping his movements calm, careful not to startle her. Shadow stood up with him, padding quietly to Lily's side. He nudged her gently, a silent invitation to stand. The girl looked at Shadow for a long moment before she hesitantly rose to her feet, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. She looked at Eli, and for the first time since they had met, her expression softened just slightly, but enough for Eli to see it. It was the beginning of something. He could feel it. Eli took a step toward the exit, the cold air hitting him again as he opened the door. He turned back to Lily, who was standing still, uncertain. "You're safe now," Eli said, his voice firm but kind. "We're going to get you out of here, Lily. No one's going by to hurt you." Lily didn't speak, but as she stepped forward, Shadow leading the way, she looked back once more, her wide eyes scanning the abandoned subway station one last time before the door closed behind them. The storm raged outside, but inside Eli's heart, something had shifted. This little girl, this fragile soul, had just become his responsibility, and he would protect her. no matter the cost. The snow continued to fall in heavy sheets, swirling around them as Eli, Shadow, and Lily walked through the storm. The world outside felt far too big, far too cold for a little girl to be lost in. The streets of Portland were eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city muffled beneath the blanket of snow. The only sounds were their footsteps, the crunch of boots on ice, and the soft padding of Shadow's paws. Lily walked beside Eli, her small form hunched in on itself, her backpack still clutched tightly in her hands. Shadow stayed close to her, walking in rhythm with her every step, his amber eyes glancing up at her every so often. She hadn't said a word since they left the abandoned subway station. Her silence felt like a weight, but Eli didn't press her. He knew better than to force her to talk. Trust was something she had to give on her own terms. They reached Eli's truck after what felt like an eternity in the cold. The wind had picked up, biting at their skin, but the warmth of the truck's interior promised relief. Eli opened the door and motioned for Lily to get inside. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to Shadow as if seeking reassurance, and then climbed in with his gentle prompting. Eli shut the door behind her, giving Shadow a quiet command to hop into the back seat. The dog did so willingly, curling up on the floor at the girl's feet, his body a comforting presence. He knew, as Eli did, that Lily needed warmth and safety more than anything else right now. Eli started the engine, the heater roaring to life, but the silence between them remained thick and suffocating. The truck's headlights cut through the falling snow as they drove through the empty streets. Eli glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror, her small face a pale ghost in the darkness. She was staring out the window, her breath fogging up the glass, but her eyes were distant, lost in something only she could see. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered, her voice a soft rasp that barely cut through the hum of the engine. Her gaze never left the window. Eli's heart squeezed at the sound of her voice, so broken, so tired. He had expected her to speak sooner, but the fact that she had said anything at all felt like progress. It was a small step, but it was something. He glanced in the rear-view mirror again, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment. "We're going to my place," he said, keeping his voice as gentle as he could. "It's safe there. You can rest." She nodded slightly, but Eli could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't sure what safe meant anymore. It wasn't the first time she had been promised safety, only to be let down. He didn't push her to speak more. The weight of her silence said enough. Instead, he turned the truck down a quiet road, the snowflakes dancing in the headlights, and tried to focus on the drive ahead. He didn't know where to start with Lily. She needed more than just shelter and warmth. She needed to feel safe enough to let her guard down, to let go of the terror she had been holding inside for so long. They reached his house modest, tucked away on the outskirts of the city, far enough to feel like an escape, but close enough to the world to remain grounded. Eli parked the truck in the driveway, the soft crunch of snow beneath the tires breaking the silence. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The house was small, but it was warm, with the kind of quiet that could fill a person's soul, if they let it. Eli had worked hard to make it a place that felt like home, even if it wasn't the same as the one he had lost. He hadn't known it at the time, but this house was a place where he could start over. Not just for him, but for the girl, sitting silently behind him. He opened the door and stepped out, walking around to the passenger side to open it for Lily. She hadn't moved from her seat, still staring out at the house, as though unsure whether she should step out of the truck at all. Eli crouched down beside her, meeting her gaze. She looked so small in the seat, as though the weight of the world was pressing her down. She was still trembling, her hands tightly clutching the backpack, as though it was her last tie to something familiar. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice calm. "You're safe here, I promise. Just come inside and get warm." Lily hesitated for a moment before she finally nodded, her shoulders sagging in exhaustion. Slowly, she climbed out of the truck, her tiny body shivering from the cold, but Eli was quick to wrap a jacket around her shoulders. She didn't flinch at the touch, but she didn't move toward him either. She just walked slowly beside him, her eyes downcast as they made their way to the door. Inside, the warmth of the house hit them immediately. The smell of pine wood, faint from the fire that was burning in the fireplace, filled the air. Eli took off his jacket and then helped Lily with hers, hanging it by the door before leading her into the living room. He motioned for her to sit on the couch, and Shadow followed them in, settling down by her feet, resting his head on the armrest. Lily glanced down at the dog, but she didn't touch him. Her fingers were still clenched tightly around her backpack. "I'll make you something warm," Eli said, keeping his voice light, even though his heart was heavy with questions. He didn't know what to ask yet. Didn't know where to start with a girl like Lily, who had been left to fend for herself in the cold world for too long. He headed for the kitchen, the soft click of his boots against the hardwood floor the only sound in the room. As he boiled water for tea, he couldn't help but glance back at her. Lily hadn't moved from the couch. She was staring down at the floor, her backpack still clutched in her lap like a shield. She didn't look up, but her eyes were wide, the faintest glimmer of something in them that Eli couldn't name yet. He returned with 2 mugs of warm tea, setting one in front of her. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but it'll help you feel better." Lily looked at the mug for a long moment before she took it with both hands, the warmth of the tea seeping into her frozen fingers. She didn't drink it right away. She just held it there, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Eli sat down across from her, his own mug in hand, and waited. "Lily," he said softly, "what happened? Who left you out there?" She didn't answer right away. The silence between them stretched, thick and painful. Then, finally, her voice cracked, small and broken. "I don't want to go back there." Eli didn't press her. He didn't need to. The weight of her words spoke volumes. He knew she wasn't just talking about the station. She was talking about everything that had brought her here. And whatever it was, Eli knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her go back. Shadow lifted his head, sensing the shift in the air. His amber eyes locked on Lily's, and he shifted closer to her, his warm body offering silent comfort. The girl looked at the dog, then at Eli, but said nothing. It didn't matter. She didn't need to speak right now. All she needed was time. Eli leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of his tea, but his mind was already racing. He had promised her safety, and he would keep that promise. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had hurt her, he would find them, and he would make sure she was never hurt again. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the coldness of the storm outside. Inside, Lily sat on the couch, her small form still wrapped in a blanket that Eli had draped around her shoulders. She had taken a few sips of the tea he made for her but remained silent. Her eyes still held that faraway look, the expression of a child who had lived through things no one should ever have to experience. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting gently on her lap, his eyes soft and watchful. The dog's presence was the only thing that seemed to calm her, the only thing that could coax her into relaxation, even if just for a moment. Eli had learned that much in the past few hours. Lily trusted the dog more than she trusted him, more than she trusted anyone else. But that was fine. He could wait. She would learn to trust him in her own time. Eli sat in the armchair across from her, his gaze flickering to the phone on the coffee table. He had texted Grace, the caseworker, after Lily had fallen asleep for a brief moment, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. It wasn't long before Grace responded, telling him she'd be here as soon as possible. But for now, Eli had nothing to do but wait, and waiting had never been something he was good at. The silence in the house was deafening. Only the crackling of the fire in the fireplace and the soft breathing of Lily and Shadow filled the air. Eli kept his eyes on Lily, his heart heavy with questions he didn't know how to ask yet. He had to be patient. He had to be the one she could rely on, even if she didn't know it yet. The sound of a car engine outside broke the quiet. Eli stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, trying not to startle Lily. She didn't flinch, but her eyes lifted to watch him. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Eli felt something shift, a small glimmer of connection, the faintest hint that she might be willing to trust him more than before. "Stay here, okay?" he said softly, his voice gentle. "I'm going to talk to someone, but I'll be right back." Lily didn't answer, but she didn't protest either. She simply nodded slightly, her fingers still gripping the frayed edges of the blanket. Eli paused at the door, glancing back at her once more before stepping out into the cold. The storm had calmed a little, but the air was still sharp and biting. Grace was waiting in her car when Eli approached, her figure hunched against the cold. She was dressed in a thick wool coat, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she stepped out to greet him. Her face was tired but resolute, the kind of face someone had after years of working with broken families and shattered lives. "How's she doing?" Grace asked, her voice soft but full of concern. "She's been through a lot," Eli said quietly. But she's alive. She's safe for now. That's a start, Grace replied, her gaze flicking to the house. Can I see her? Eli nodded, leading Grace inside. As they walked through the door, the warmth from the fire and the smell of the house surrounded them. Grace glanced around, taking in the modest but clean surroundings. Her eyes fell on Lily, still sitting on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, her eyes now closed as she rested her head against the armrest. Shadow lay beside her, his presence an unspoken promise of safety. Eli motioned to the couch. She's been sleeping on and off. It's the first time she's actually rested since I found her. Grace moved closer to Lily, kneeling down beside the couch, her eyes softening as she took in the girl's small form. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of Shadow's breathing as he lay beside Lily. Lily, Grace said gently, her voice calm and reassuring. My name is Grace. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened? Lily stirred, her eyes flicking open slowly, her gaze meeting Grace's. She didn't speak, but her lips trembled as she looked around the room as if seeking reassurance. Grace smiled softly, her expression warm, but she didn't push her. She knew better than to ask too much too soon. Sometimes, just being present was enough. It's okay, sweetheart, Grace continued, her voice filled with understanding. You don't have to tell me anything if you're not ready, but I'm here to keep you safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Lily's eyes flickered between Eli and Grace, the uncertainty still thick in her gaze. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to go back. Eli's stomach clenched at the words, the fear in her voice sending a cold shiver down his spine. He had heard the same thing from too many children before, too many kids who had been hurt by the ones who were supposed to protect them. Grace met Eli's eyes for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew what it meant. She knew the gravity of the situation. Where did you come from, Lily? Grace asked softly, her voice steady but filled with compassion. Lily's hands clenched the blanket tighter, her face hardening for a moment before she looked away, her gaze fixed on the ground. She didn't answer, but the tension in her body told Eli all he needed to know. Eli knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. Lily, I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. You don't have to be afraid anymore. But I need to know what happened. Who did this to you? The girl hesitated, her fingers trembling as she finally spoke again, her words barely a whisper. Mark. He's not my real dad. He hurts me. Eli's heart dropped into his stomach. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made him feel sick. He could already hear the name echoing in his mind. Mark. The man who had done this to her, who had left her alone in the cold. Grace's expression tightened, but she kept her voice soft and steady. You're safe now, Lily. I promise. No one's going to hurt you again. Lily looked at Eli, her eyes wide, and for the first time he saw something in them, a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. She looked down at Shadow, who had shifted closer to her, his warm body a comforting weight against her side. Lily's hand reached out, hesitating for a moment, before she gently brushed her fingers against his fur. She took a shuddering breath as if finally allowing herself to believe that she was safe. Eli exhaled slowly, his heart heavy but resolute. This was just the beginning. He had promised her safety, and now he would make sure she would never have to feel the pain of being abandoned again. Whatever it took, he would protect her. The days passed slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Eli hadn't left Lily's side since she had arrived at his house. His mind raced with questions about what Mark had done to her, about why she had been left to fend for herself in the cold. But every time he looked at her, sitting quietly by the fire with Shadow at her feet, her fragile form huddled in the warmth of the home, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let her go back. Not to Mark, not to that nightmare. Grace had come and gone, filing reports and making calls. The paperwork had begun. A custody hearing was set for the following week, and the more they uncovered about Mark's behavior, the more Eli could feel the weight of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about custody, it was about saving Lily from a man who had taken advantage of her, who had hurt her in ways no child should ever experience. Eli sat at the kitchen table, his fingers gripping a pen as he wrote down a list of questions for the lawyer Grace had recommended. He had called her yesterday Sarah Coleman, a sharp, experienced attorney who specialized in child welfare cases. He wasn't sure how he felt about lawyers, but from what Grace had told him, Sarah was someone who would fight for Lily. and that was all that mattered. As he wrote, his mind drifted to Lily, who was sitting in the living room, sketching in her notebook. He hadn't seen her smile yet, really smile, but he had seen the faintest curve of her lips when she'd drawn shadow in a picture, his large form carefully shaded beside her. She was still distant, still closed off, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where he saw something in her eyes that told him she was starting to trust him. She was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was safe. The sound of the doorbell pulled Eli from his thoughts. He stood up quickly, his heart rate picking up. It was still early, and he wasn't expecting anyone else today. As he made his way to the door, he glanced over at Lily, who hadn't moved. Shadow, sensing the change in the air, stood up from his resting place and padded over to Eli's side. Eli opened the door, and there stood Sarah Coleman, her tall frame wrapped in a dark coat, her auburn hair tucked into a neat bun. She looked every bit the professional lawyer Eli had imagined, confident, composed, yet there was a kindness in her eyes, a softness that made her approachable despite the sharp edge of her demeanor. "Eli," Sarah said with a firm handshake, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No," Eli replied, stepping aside to let her in. "You're right on time." Sarah smiled and nodded, stepping into the warmth of the house. She had a briefcase in hand, and her eyes scanned the room, taking in the simple yet comforting space Eli had made. Her gaze softened when it landed on Lily, who was still sitting by the fire, the faint light of the flames dancing across her face. "How's she doing?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice low so as not to disturb Lily. "She's still quiet," Eli said, his voice trailing off. "She hasn't said much more, but I think she's starting to trust us. It's going to take time." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "I understand. It's not easy for children like her. But the good news is that we're starting to build a case." Eli's heart clenched. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, laying them out on the table. "I've reviewed the reports from CPS, the evidence of abuse, and the financial records. I also had a conversation with Grace earlier today. We have enough to file an emergency protective order. It won't be easy, but it's a start." Eli leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. "What do we do next?" Sarah's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment there was an understanding between them. She wasn't just here to win a case, she was here to make sure Lily had a chance at a life free of fear. "Next, we need to get Lily out of Mark's custody. That means we need a court order, and we need to act fast. He won't go down without a fight. We can expect him to try and turn the system against us. He'll do whatever it takes to keep Lily under his control." Eli's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. He had known Mark was dangerous, but hearing Sarah's words made it feel all the more real. "What's the first step?" Sarah's voice softened, but her tone was firm. "We'll file the paperwork for the protective order and schedule the custody hearing. But we also need to make sure Lily is safe in the meantime. This is going to get messy, and we need to prepare her for what's coming. I know it's a lot to ask, but we need her to be strong, Eli." Eli looked back at Lily, who hadn't moved since Sarah's arrival. She had been so quiet, so withdrawn, and it broke his heart to see her like that. He knew she wasn't ready for what was about to happen, but there was no other choice. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect her," Eli said, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let him hurt her again." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "That's exactly what I need to hear." Later that evening, Eli and Lily sat together in the living room, shadow curled at their feet. The warmth from the fire filled the room, but the heaviness of the day hung in the air. Eli had made dinner, but Lily had barely touched her plate, her mind far away. "Lily," Eli said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I know this is hard, but we're going to get through this. You're safe here. You don't have to worry about Mark anymore." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. There was a glimmer of something in her eyes, a faint trace of the girl she used to be, before the world had taken so much from her. "I don't want to go back," she whispered again, her voice small and fragile. Eli's heart broke. "You won't, Lily. You won't ever have to go back." She finally reached out, her fingers brushing the top of Shadow's head, as if drawing comfort from the dog's warm presence. The smallest of smiles tugged at the corners of her lips, but it was enough. It was the first time he had seen her smile, even if just a little. It was a start. The days leading up to the court hearing felt like a slow march towards something inevitable. The weather had grown colder, the streets of Portland now buried beneath fresh layers of snow. The house, once a sanctuary of quiet comfort, now felt like a battleground as Eli and Grace prepared for the fight ahead. Grace had been working tirelessly, gathering every scrap of evidence they could find to strengthen their case. The photographs of Lily's bruises, the financial records of Mark's fraudulent claims, and the testimonies from CPS and the medical professionals all pointed to one undeniable truth. Mark had been abusing Lily, both physically and emotionally. But no matter how strong their case was, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Mark was powerful, manipulative, he had connections. He would fight this with everything he had, and Eli wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to protect the little girl who had only just begun to trust him. Eli sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him, staring at the documents scattered across the surface. His mind was consumed by the thought of what would happen if they lost, what would happen if Lily was forced to return to Mark's home. He couldn't bear the thought of it. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything she had been through. Lily sat on the couch, her eyes downcast, her fingers tracing patterns in the fabric of the blanket she was wrapped in. Her silence was louder than any words, and Eli could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. She was still so fragile, so lost in her own world. But there were moments when he saw a glimmer of something that reminded him that she wasn't broken beyond repair. Eli stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He walked over to the couch, kneeling beside Lily, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't look up at him, but her body relaxed just slightly under his touch. "Hey, kiddo," Eli said softly, his voice gentle. "You doing okay?" Lily nodded, though it was clear she wasn't really there. Her mind seemed a million miles away, lost in thoughts that Eli couldn't begin to understand. He wasn't sure if she even knew how to answer that question anymore. "I know you're scared," he continued, his voice low, "but you're not alone in this. We're going to get through it together, okay?" She didn't respond, but her fingers tightened around the edges of the blanket. Eli squeezed her shoulder once more before standing up. He had to keep moving, keep pushing forward for her, even if she wasn't ready to face what was coming. It was late that afternoon when the phone call came. Eli was in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee, when his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and saw Sarah's name. His stomach tightened as he answered the call. "Eli," Sarah's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that caught his attention. "We've got a problem." His heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Mark's attorney filed a motion for a temporary injunction," Sarah explained, her voice tight with frustration. "They're trying to get Lily returned to Mark's custody until the hearing. We have to fight this immediately, or she'll be sent back there. It's a last-minute move, and we didn't expect it, but we can't afford to let him win this." Eli's breath hitched in his chest. He couldn't breathe. The thought of Lily being sent back to Mark was unbearable. He had promised her she was safe, and now it felt like that promise was slipping through his fingers. "What do we do?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We file an emergency response to block the injunction," Sarah said quickly. "We need to present everything we have: medical records, witness statements, the CPS reports. If we don't, Mark will have an open path to getting her back. We can't let that happen, Eli." Eli closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "I won't let her go back. Not after everything she's been through. I'll do whatever it takes." "I know you will," Sarah said, her tone softening. "We'll get through this. We just need to stay focused." The call ended, but Eli remained standing there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. His thoughts raced. Mark's lawyer had just thrown a massive wrench into their plans, and Eli didn't know if they could fight it off in time. He had to act fast. He couldn't afford to lose. The next morning was a blur of frantic phone calls, last-minute meetings with Sarah, and a flurry of legal documents being prepared for court. Grace was on the phone with CPS, making sure all their reports were filed correctly and that Lily's safety was prioritized. Eli felt like he was running on fumes, but there was no time to stop. There was no time to rest. When the court hearing finally arrived, it felt like a battle waiting to happen. Eli stood outside the courthouse, his breath clouding in the cold air. Shadow was by his side, sensing the tension in the air, his amber eyes focused on the door ahead. Eli knew that whatever happened inside that courtroom would change everything. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. It was Grace, walking up with Sarah beside her. Sarah was dressed sharply in a dark suit, her expression calm but resolute. Grace, on the other hand, looked exhausted but determined. She had been working around the clock to make sure Lily was safe, But Eli knew she too was feeling the pressure of the situation. "We've got this," Sarah said, her voice confident as she approached Eli. "We'll fight for Lily, and we won't back down." Eli nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. "I'm not letting her go back. Whatever happens in there, we do what we have to do to protect her." Grace placed a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. Lily's safe now. Let's keep it that way." As they entered the courthouse, Eli's heart raced. This wasn't just about a custody dispute, it was about Lily's future, and Eli wasn't going to let anyone take her away from the safety she had found in his home. He would fight to the very end. The courtroom was a cold, sterile place, its air thick with tension as the judge entered and the proceedings began. Eli sat at the front with Grace and Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Shadow was seated beside him, the dog's amber eyes locked on too. Eli's, sensing the unease radiating off of him. Today wasn't just another hearing. Today, everything was on the line. The legal battle to keep Lily away from Mark had reached its peak, and the weight of the situation settled heavily on Eli's shoulders. He had promised Lily that she would be safe, that she would never have to go back to the man who had hurt her. But now, it felt like they were on the edge of losing everything. Mark sat across the room, his presence as imposing as ever. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold and unyielding. He was a man who was used to controlling situations, used to bending the system to his will. Eli could feel the hatred radiating from him, the threat of what he would do if he managed to win this fight. Mark's attorney was beside him, a sharp-eyed man who spoke with authority, but it was Mark's glaring eyes that bore into Eli, a silent challenge hanging in the air between them. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order. "We are here to finalize the custody hearing for Lily Carter. The petitioner, Mark Dawson, seeks temporary custody, while the respondent, Eli Hayes, has filed for guardianship. Let us proceed." Eli sat straighter, his jaw clenched, as the lawyer for Mark stood up, moving toward the bench with a calm, practiced confidence. His words were smooth, rehearsed. He had no doubt that he would win the case. "Your Honor," Mark's lawyer began, "the defendant, Mr. Hayes, has no legal standing to take custody of the child. While we acknowledge the allegations made against Mr. Dawson, we maintain that he is Lily's rightful guardian, and she has been well cared for under his supervision. These allegations are fabricated to discredit a man who has provided for her." Eli's hands tightened into fists at his sides, but Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm, a silent reminder to stay focused. They had prepared for this moment. They had gathered their evidence, their witnesses, but there was something chilling in the way Mark's lawyer spoke, something that told Eli they were about to enter a battle that would require every ounce of strength he had. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she rose to her feet, her posture straight and determined. She had the composure of a woman who had fought for justice for years, and Eli could see that she was ready to take Mark down, piece by piece. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice clear and unwavering, "the evidence we have presented shows that Mark Dawson is not fit to care for Lily. He has subjected her to physical and emotional abuse. This is not a case of custody. This is a case of protecting a child from further harm. We have medical records, witness testimonies, and CPS reports that demonstrate the ongoing abuse Lily has suffered in his care." Mark's lawyer scoffed, attempting to interrupt, but the judge raised her hand, silencing him. Sarah continued, her tone steady but impassioned. "Lily is not safe with Mr. Dawson. She has told us, in her own words, that she does not want to go back to him. She is terrified of returning to his custody. The trauma she has experienced is undeniable. We cannot, in good conscience, allow her to be sent back to a place where she has suffered so much." Eli Hayes, the defendant, has opened his home to Lily and has provided a safe environment for her. He is willing to fight for her, to protect her from the man who has hurt her. And we ask this court to grant him guardianship, to keep Lily safe from the threat of returning to her abuser. The room fell silent as Sarah's words echoed in the air. Eli could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. This was the moment that would decide Lily's future. He could see the judge's face, her eyes flicking from the documents to Mark's lawyer, then back to him. There was a long pause before she spoke. "I will review the evidence and make a decision after considering the arguments presented today," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. "The court will reconvene in 1 hour. The next hour felt like a lifetime." Eli stood outside the courtroom, pacing back and forth, his thoughts racing. Shadow sat by his side, his head resting on Eli's leg, as the dog sensed the tension in the air. Grace was speaking quietly to Sarah, discussing the next steps, but Eli couldn't focus on anything other than the thought of Lily, of her safety, of her future. He glanced back through the glass doors into the courtroom, where Mark was still seated, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the proceedings. Mark had the look of a man who knew how to manipulate the system, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was ready to do whatever it took to win. But Eli couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Mark take Lily back. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. Eli, Grace said, breaking him from his thoughts. We need you to stay calm. You've done everything you can. We'll be fine. But Eli wasn't sure if that was true. Every part of him wanted to rush in there to make sure the judge knew just how dangerous Mark was. But he couldn't act rashly. He had to trust Sarah, trust the system, trust that this time they would do the right thing. When the court reconvened, Eli sat back down, his hands gripping the edge of the chair, his heart racing. He looked over at Lily, who was sitting silently beside Grace, her eyes wide and uncertain. She didn't understand everything happening around her, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to go back to Mark. And that was enough for Eli. It had to be. The judge cleared her throat, and all eyes turned to her. She spoke with authority, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Eli. After reviewing the evidence presented and considering the testimony of the defendant and his counsel, she began, I have come to a prime decision. The court finds that the petitioner, Mark Dawson, has failed to demonstrate that he is a fit guardian for Lily Carter. The allegations of abuse are substantiated, and the child's wishes to remain with the defendant, Eli Hayes, are taken into account. As such, the court grants guardianship of Lily Carter to Eli Hayes, effective immediately. The room erupted into murmurs, but Eli barely heard it. His heart was racing as he looked at Lily, who was staring up at him, her wide eyes filled with disbelief. The weight of the decision hung in the air, but all Eli could focus on was the relief flooding through him. Lily was safe. She was finally going to be safe. Eli stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, and walked over to Lily. He kneeled down in front of her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Shadow padded over beside him, nuzzling her hand in silent reassurance. Lily looked up at him, her eyes still wide, as if she couldn't quite believe it. You're safe now, Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Lily nodded slowly, her fingers reaching out to touch Shadow's fur once more, as if grounding herself in the reality of what had just happened. Eli could see the smallest flicker of hope in her eyes, and it was enough to make his chest tighten with emotion. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a soft thud, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eli let out the breath he had been holding. His hands, still shaking, reached for Lily's, pulling her gently into his side. Shadow, ever the faithful companion, trotted beside them, his head held high as if he knew the victory they had just won. The winter sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snowy streets of Portland. The snow, which had once seemed so cold and unforgiving, now felt like a blanket of protection, wrapping them all in warmth after the storm. You did it, Grace said softly, walking alongside them with a proud smile on her face. Her eyes were tired, but filled with a quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, but today they had won a victory for Lily and for Eli. Eli glanced down at Lily, who was still holding his hand tightly, but her small frame had relaxed for the first time in days. She wasn't looking over her shoulder at every turn, wasn't flinching at every noise. Her steps, though hesitant, seemed lighter, as if the weight she had been carrying for so long had finally started to lift. It's not over yet, though, Sarah said, walking ahead of them, her tone calm but pragmatic. We still have a few things to iron out before everything is finalized. But for now, Eli, you've done exactly what she needed. Eli nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest, but it was no longer out of fear. It was the kind of intensity that came with relief, with knowing that the girl beside him was finally safe. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They reached the car, and Eli opened the door for Lily, helping her inside. Shadow jumped into the back seat, curling up immediately, as if content to be near her. Eli climbed into the driver's seat, but before starting the engine, he turned to Lily, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. I told you we'd keep you safe, didn't I? he asked, his eyes locking with hers in the rearview mirror. Lily met his gaze for the first time with a small, tentative smile. The smile wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, a flicker of hope in her eyes that Eli hadn't realized he had been waiting for. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice soft and uncertain, but something in her tone told Eli that she was starting to believe it. "You did?" Eli started the car, and as they pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, the city spread before them, still blanketed in snow. The streets were quieter now, the world slowing down after the chaos of the past few days. It felt like a new beginning, not just for Lily, but for all of them. The storm had passed, and though there were still challenges ahead, they would face them together. As they drove through the streets of Portland, Eli thought back to the moment when he first found Lily, huddled alone in the abandoned subway station. He had promised her safety, but in a way, she had given him something in return. She had reminded him that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance for redemption, for both of them. The drive back to his house was filled with the soft hum of the car's engine, the sound of Lily gently speaking to Shadow in the back seat, the occasional laugh as she shared a quiet moment with the dog. It was a far cry from the tense silence they had shared just days ago. It felt right. When they arrived at the house, Eli parked the car and turned off the engine. The house was quiet, just as they had left it, but it now felt fuller, filled with the promise of something new. He opened the door, and they stepped inside, the warmth of the house greeting them like an old friend. Lily paused just inside the door, looking around at the familiar space. For the first time, there was a sense of peace in her posture. She wasn't looking for an escape, wasn't searching for danger. She was just there, safe. "You're home now," Eli said softly, closing the door behind them. "This is your home, Lily." Lily turned to him, her small face illuminated by the soft glow of the living room light. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, just looked at him with those wide, silent eyes. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going back there, right?" Eli's heart clenched, but he smiled, kneeling down in front of her so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "No," he said firmly. "You're not. You're never going back there. You're safe here, and you always will be." Lily nodded, a small, fragile sigh escaping her lips. For a brief moment, she seemed to relax, as though the weight of the world had finally been lifted off her small shoulders. She reached down to stroke Shadow's fur, her fingers brushing over his warm coat, a small smile creeping onto her face. "I like it here," she said softly, almost to herself. Eli's chest tightened with emotion, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He could see it in her face, the beginning of healing, the start of something that felt like hope. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal together. Later that evening, as the house settled into a peaceful quiet, Eli sat on the porch, staring out at the calm lake that stretched beyond his backyard. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the landscape. Shadow sat beside him, his head resting against Eli's leg, as if the dog knew that this moment was something important. Eli leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the arms, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He thought of his late wife, Claire, and of Emily, and though the pain of their loss would never fully leave him, he realized that maybe he wasn't alone anymore. Maybe the healing he had been searching for had been right here all along in the girl who had entered his life in the darkest of moments. "You did it," Eli whispered to Shadow, though it was as much for himself as it was for the dog. "We did it." In the distance, Lily's soft laugh echoed through the house as she played with her crayons and paper, the sound of her laughter bright and pure. Eli closed his eyes, the weight of everything he had been carrying finally lifting. For the first time in so long, he allowed himself to smile.